Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 7, which is on socialization, or as I jokingly refer to there in the subtitle, how we are all brainwashed. And a big part of what I'll try to show in this lecture is that we have been brainwashed in the sense that we have learned from our particular social environment how to understand the world in certain ways and how to think of ourselves in certain ways. And so we have been brainwashed on some fundamental level. Now, the idea of being brainwashed and brainwashing usually has a negative connotation to it. It's usually not a compliment to tell someone they've been brainwashed. But the reality is that a lot of the brainwashing that does occur with us is both natural and good, at least in the sense that we need to be brainwashed in one way, or in some sense, in order for us to be functioning, capable people later in real life. And part of that, through kind of this natural or the amount of brainwashing that we need to go through, that any person needs to go through, can lead us to a point where we then can become critical thinkers. And then we can look back upon the things that we've learned through socialization, and we can start to make judgments about whether those things were good or bad. So, in some sense, we need to be brainwashed in order to become capable people that are then able to critically analyze the brainwashing process that we live through and that helped form who we are as individuals. All right, so what do we mean by socialization? For my money, this is the best definition I've seen out there, and it comes from Calhoun. And he says socialization is the process through which individuals internalize the values, beliefs, and norms of society, and for me, this is the key part, and learn to function as its members. And if you are in this class, if you've made it to Gettysburg College, you have been successfully socialized. You've learned certain values, beliefs, and norms, and you are able to function as a capable member of this particular society. So congratulations, you are a successful product of socialization. And the reality is that individuals do need to be socialized in order for them to be able to act as functioning members of a particular society. And if they're not, then certain corrective processes have to come into place, which we'll talk about later in the lecture. And socialization is important in that it allows for social reproduction in the sense that there's continuity from day to day and how the social world is relatively stable on a day-to-day basis. And so this allows for a particular social group to continue over time from day to day, month to month, year to year, generation to generation. And along the way, there are changes. Big, significant social changes can occur. Crises can occur. The pandemic has changed a lot. But nevertheless, like kind of the deep social infrastructure that socialization deals with tends to remain relatively stable over time. And that does allow for social reproduction to occur. And ultimately, what I'll try to show in this lecture is that much of what we think and do is the product of nurture, not nature, which is another way of saying a lot of this is the product of sociology and not biology. Now, I want to clarify a point. I'm not going to argue, there are some people in sociology that argue that basically everything is a social construction. So everything then would be the product of socialization, as if there is no biology there that determines what we do. And I think that overstates the case. In contrast, there are some people who I think overemphasize the role of nature and assume that we are basically the products of our genes and social influences don't play any role on us. And I think all the current research is showing that both of these things are really important and in terms of how they work together. And so they both play a really important role in shaping who we are. But given American culture and our focus on individuality, we as a culture tend to underplay the role of nurture or sociological forces that shape us and help shape who we are as individuals and how we understand the world. And that's why I want to spend more time focusing on these sociological aspects and the role that socialization plays in shaping who we are. And one way we can do this is by seeing socialization in action or cases where we can identify the products of socialization. And one key example of this is what we saw in the Davis reading and also the short documentary you saw from TLC on feral children. And so what is a so-called feral child? This is a child who has been severely deprived of social connections in their younger years. And we see this both with the case of Jeannie, you saw in the documentary, and Anna in the Davis reading, that these were two children who were severely neglected while growing up. And so in some cases, in one way you can think of feral children as pure cases of human nature, right? These are kids who have grown up in the absence of social influence. So most of who they are must be the product of their biology, of human nature. And then so the question is, well, what do these pure products or close to pure products of human nature look like? And the answer is they appear to be very different from what we traditionally think of as normal development. And another way to put this is that they lack many of the characteristics that we see as being quintessentially human. For example, it's not uncommon for children who are neglected like this to never be able to develop language or linguistic skills. To refer back to what we talked about with symbolic interactionism, many children, these neglected children, can learn to understand signs, but not symbols. They can't think symbolically in the ways that we can, or kids who develop under more normal circumstances can. And what this is a function of is the fact that these children who are extremely socially neglected, their brains do not develop the same way that kids do under, quote unquote, normal circumstances. And so here is just one example that we can see of different brain scans between a normal 3-year-old child and one who's been extremely neglected. And anywhere where you see black over here, these are parts of the brains that are or underdeveloped. And these are basically, at least my rudimentary understanding of how the brain works, is that the more connections that your brain has, the more brain function you have. So connections are a good thing. All these black spots over here are where connections have not been made. So that's kind of like dead space inside of the brain. And so these children just won't develop with the same mental capacities as would be the case if they had grown up under normal circumstances. All right. And so what do these kind of cases that are thankfully very rare, but pretty significant in terms of informing us about the role of nature and nurture and socialization, but what do these cases tell us about human nature? They tell us that part of our human nature is that we need to be socialized. We are social beings, and in order to be able to develop as an individual and to think in individualistic terms and be able to think critically about oneself and the things one is learning and the things that one has been taught about by their society, in order to think in these individualistic terms, we need to be the products of socialization. So sometimes people pose a comparison or a contrast between, social forces and individualistic ones, and you say that, these are antithetical to one another, either social or you're individual. But what we see is these actually are fundamentally related. Being socialized, the product of a social environment, actually allows us to be an individual. In some really, in the most, probably the most profound sense of the term, be able to think of yourself in individualistic terms and be able to have critical thinking capacities. And so how do these examples relate to sociological imagination? This touches upon what I just mentioned. The sociological imagination talks about how, there are troubles and issues. And what we see here is that individual personality we might think of in terms of being a trouble in that our personality is unique to us. But the reality is it's actually more of an issue in that social forces have very much enabled us to think of ourselves as an individual, as someone who is disconnected from his or her social environment. So here again, we see that the role that social forces play in developing us as individuals, and that these forces then are not antithetical to one another, they actually complement one another. All right, another example of socialization, or we can see the product of socialization, is accents. And it's really interesting to think about this in that it's actually generally quite hard for us, if we were to move into a society that speaks a different language, to lose our accent. I think some people are better at this than others. In general, the younger that you're exposed to a different language environment, the less likely you are to have an accent or to never develop an accent. But accents are very telling in that within a particular language family, we come to learn how to pronounce certain things in a certain way. And this is a product of how we hold our mouth, what we do with our tongue, how different muscles in our jaw, in our jaw area have developed. And then when we're asked then to start pronouncing new things in a different way, it can be quite hard for us to make that transition. And that's why we watched the little clip about American people trying to say, native English speakers trying to pronounce Spanish words and the troubles that they can have with that pronunciation. We have to imagine that if those people who are native English speakers had grown up in an environment where they spoke Spanish, they would have no problem, right, saying those things, rolling their R's, stuff like that. But because they've learned how to pronounce things the English way, and that has been essentially they've come to develop a muscle memory for how to pronounce certain things in a certain way. When they're asked then to do different things, it can be quite hard, and they'd have to really train in order to overcome their accent. So the fact that we have accents is really the effect and the product of socialization and how we've come to learn to pronounce things in a particular way. All right, and then another example is how we can see cross-cultural and historical variations in emotions. And this is why I think that Invisibilia podcast is really good, because it shows or exposes us to a type of emotion that probably none of us have or are able to understand, but nevertheless exists in a particular culture. So, as you saw, Leggett, right? That feeling of being unmoored. And it's a quite complex emotion that has a lot of nuance and substance to it. But it's one that, unless we had grown up in an environment where this was a standard emotion, where we would have a hard time understanding what it is. I don't imagine many of us would feel like it because we haven't learned how to feel or experience the world in these terms. And it's quite interesting if you look around in different cultures, there are cultures that have emotions that just don't translate into, say, the standard American emotional context. But even if you stick within the American historical context, you can see that there has been historical variations in emotions, right? So, um, if you picture like the quintessential 1950s white middle class dad, that is my dad, all right, and all the stereotypes or most of the stereotypes apply to him. One of which is that his emotional repertoire is quite small. There's like anger, frustration, and happy, and content, and those are like the four different emotional notes that he has. And in part, that was a function of the time that he grew up when men were not supposed to be very emotional. Um, and so, even like things like sadness, like I don't know if I've ever really seen my dad sad. I don't know if he has that emotion, or maybe he has that emotion, but he hides it. But it's definitely not something that he expresses. Where I personally feel more freedom to express a broader range of emotions than I think he and other members of his generation did. And then I think that's even more true for my son. I think um, the menu of emotions is broader for him and his generation than it was for me, and certainly for his grandfather. All right, what we'll do next is we'll take a look at a theory of motions and see how these can actually be the product of socialization. And then we'll talk about one other way in which you can see socialization in action. And then we will transition over to talking about the different stages of socialization that we can see in society.